Welcome! You're listening to the Uncharted Lancaster podcast, where we explore the hidden histories, forgotten places, and long-buried secrets of Lancaster County. Using modern digital storytelling tools, each episode brings a new piece of local lore to life, revealing the strange, the surprising, and the stories history left behind. Let's begin.
Imagine a man, standing in the executive boardroom of a major American railroad and lumber company. He's finalizing freight logistics, he's reviewing supply chains, and, counting massive stacks of commercial profit.
Yeah, the picture of 19th century success.
Exactly. But then imagine that exact same man, just a few hours later, in the dead of night, hiding 17 escaped slaves in the secret compartments of those exact same trains.
Oh, it's wild.
He is literally risking everything to smuggle them across enemy lines. Today, we're looking at a historical figure who completely shatters, the neat little boxes we usually put people into. We're looking at a man who essentially weaponized American capitalism against itself.
What's fascinating here is the sheer scale of the contradiction in his life. I mean, the man we are exploring today, William Whipper, was literally everything that 19th century racist propaganda claimed a black man could not be. He was staggeringly wealthy, highly educated, and a recognized leader in national politics. And yet, because of the deeply sensitive nature of his work, his absolute greatest achievements, like the logistical masterpieces that truly shaped the nation, they had to be kept entirely secret during his prime.
Because if they weren't, he'd be ruined, or worse.
Exactly. He was living out in the open, but operating completely in the shadows.
And that is the core mission of this deep dive. We are exploring the extraordinary, paradox-filled life of William Whipper to uncover how a Black American in the 1800s managed to balance vast personal wealth with extreme personal risk.
It's a tough balance to strike.
Very. And for you listening, think of this as a masterclass in pragmatic heroism. This isn't just about what someone believed in theory, right? It's about how they actually deployed their resources, their real estate, and their capital to fight an entrenched, unjust system.
Yeah, the literal nuts and bolts of activism.
Precisely. And to do this, we are pulling from a really fascinating stack of sources. We've got several biographical texts, and honestly, most incredibly, a highly detailed primary source letter written by Whipper himself in 1871.
To William Still, right.
Yeah, his fellow abolitionist.
It is a remarkable document. I mean, by 1871, the Civil War is over, the 13th Amendment has abolished slavery, and Whipper is finally, able to speak openly about this clandestine infrastructure he spent decades building and protecting.
Because he couldn't exactly write this stuff down in 1840.
Right, definitely not. But to truly understand the sheer force of will it took to build that infrastructure, we can't just start at the height of his power. We really have to examine the incredibly complex environment into which he was born.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can understand the massive logistical empire he built, we really have to look at the unique circumstances of his birth. His origins completely set the stage for this dual life.
They really do.
So William Whipper was born in 1804 in Drumore Township. That's in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And the dynamic of his household is, complex, to put it mildly.
That's an understatement.
Right. His mother, Nance, was an enslaved African-American house servant. His father, who was also her owner, was Reverend Francis Allison Latta.
And, Reverend Latta wasn't just some casual figure in the community. He was actually the principal of a highly regarded Latin school in Drumore.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, an institution that had actually been founded by his own father, Reverend James Latta, way back in 1770. So William is born into this incredibly fraught, unequal dynamic.
Yeah, you have an enslaved mother and a white owner father who is also one of the region's most prominent educators. The psychological weight of that dynamic must have just been immense for a kid.
Absolutely.
But here is where the story diverges from what we might typically expect when we look at the historical record of that era. William didn't just receive, a basic education. Our sources show he received a private education that was, by all accounts, completely equal to the education given to his white half-siblings.
Which is pretty extraordinary for the time.
It is. He would actually later frequently refer to the superior education he was given by his father.
And it's a critical foundation for him. He is armed very early on with an elite classical education. He understands literature, rhetoric, and presumably, the mechanics of commerce and philosophy.
Right.
And he takes that whole intellectual toolkit with him when he moves to Philadelphia as a young man in the 1820s. And this is interesting. He doesn't walk into a white-collar job.
No, he doesn't.
He begins his professional life working as a steam scourer.
Which is a detail that initially threw me, honestly.
Yeah.
But looking at our sources, steam scouring was essentially a brand new, innovative process for cleaning and pressing clothing at the time.
Right, it was cutting edge.
So right out of the gate, he is engaging with new technology, new industries. He's not doing traditional manual labor. I mean, he is actively capitalizing on an emerging market.
Precisely. He recognizes a technological advancement and leverages it to build his initial capital. And then he channels the success of that first venture into his next major move.
The grocery store.
Exactly, opening a grocery store in Philadelphia. But this wasn't just a place to buy flour and sugar. He opens a store that explicitly supports the temperance movement, and crucially, it only sells mercantile goods that were created completely free of slave labor.
See, this reminds me less of a 19th century merchant and more of like a modern, socially conscious startup founder. Or honestly, someone running a clandestine intelligence agency using a legitimate shell corporation.
That's a great way to look at it.
He's essentially auditing his entire supply chain to ensure it aligns with a Black Ops mission of freedom. He is saying, I am going to run a highly profitable business, but I refuse to let my commerce fund the machinery of the enemy.
Yeah.
He was doing this in the 1820s.
And his rationale for supporting the temperance movement is equally analytical. It wasn't just, a moral panic about drinking.
Right. It was deeper than that.
Our sources note that he viewed liquor as having a violently destructive effect on Africa. He believed that alcohol consumption and the trade of spirits were actually contributing factors that led Africans to sell their own people into slavery.
Oh, wow. So he's looking at the big picture.
He's looking at global supply chains, analyzing social behaviors, and tracing their moral consequences across entire continents.
He's connecting the local sale of rum in Philadelphia to the global destabilization of the African continent. That is just brilliant. And, he's not just working in isolation either. He quickly becomes part of Philadelphia's intellectual elite.
Very quickly.
He's connecting with organizations tied to Bishop Richard Allen, who is the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He joins these new intellectual societies. There's one specifically called the Reading Room Society for the Men of Color, who are citizens of the city and liberties of Philadelphia.
And the aim of that society was very clear. It was for the mental improvement of people of color in the neighborhood of Philadelphia.
Right.
They were creating these safe spaces for intellectual rigor, debate, and strategic planning. And when they needed someone to actually draft their constitution, they turned to William Whipper.
So he is establishing himself as a thinker, a writer, and a businessman all at once. But we really need to dig into the why of it all. Like, what was the driving philosophy behind his specific brand of activism at this early stage?
Because it wasn't just anger, right?
Exactly. It wasn't just raw anger. It was a highly structured theory.
His ideology during this period was complex, and it was heavily rooted in a concept known as moral reform. Initially, Whipper theorized that white prejudice against Black Americans stemmed primarily from the condition in which Black people found themselves, not strictly the color of their skin.
That's a massive distinction to make in the 1820s. He's basically arguing that the oppression is circumstantial, not biological.
Exactly. He stipulated that if Black Americans could improve their mental, economic, and moral situations, they would essentially force society to accept them.
Yeah, I see.
The idea was that by making these improvements and conforming to, or even exceeding, the societal standards of the day, social acceptance would just become inevitable. He believed moral reform served as a check on evil dispositions and inculcated moral principles across all of society.
And he didn't just talk about this behind closed doors in small reading rooms. He published extensively on the mechanics of social change. There's this one essay he wrote when he was just 24 years old called An Address on Non-Resistance to Offensive Aggression.
That essay is a landmark document in American history. It really is.
Yeah.
In it, he suggests that nonviolent means of moral righteousness are absolutely necessary to encourage a peaceful political movement toward change. When you read the analysis of this text, it is widely considered a direct precursor to the exact same nonviolent strategies that would be adopted by the civil rights movement over a century later.
It's mind-blowing.
He is laying the intellectual groundwork for nonviolent resistance in his early 20s. He's arguing that meeting violence with violence only perpetuates the degradation of the oppressed, and that true power comes from moral superiority.
It's an incredible intellectual foundation. But, theory only goes so far when you are dealing with a brutal systemic reality.
Right.
And Whipper doesn't just stay in the realm of theory. He realizes that to actually move the needle, he needs massive logistical leverage, which explains his next major move, leaving the intellectual hubs of Philadelphia for the rugged industrial realities of Columbia, Pennsylvania.
The geography of freedom. This is where theory meets practice in the most intense way imaginable.
So in 1835, Whipper leaves Philadelphia and relocates to Columbia with a fellow Black entrepreneur named Stephen Smith. Now, when you dive into historical records, things can get a little murky, and we see that in our sources regarding Whipper's family ties to Stephen Smith.
Oh, yes, the family connection.
Yeah. One source notes that in 1836, Whipper married Stephen Smith's only daughter, Harriet. However, another source mentions a Harriet Smith as Stephen Smith's sister.
It is a classic archival contradiction. Family names get reused constantly, and historical records get transcribed incorrectly over the centuries. But, whether Harriet was his daughter or his sister, the crucial takeaway here is the function of the marriage.
Right, the alliance.
Exactly. Whipper and Smith cemented their business partnership with a family alliance. They were consolidating their power and building a dynasty.
And what a dynasty it was. Together, they create one of the state's absolute premier lumberyards, located right on the banks of the Susquehanna River. And we have to stop and look at this specific location because the geography here is just everything.
It really is.
Why Columbia? Why this specific river?
Because the Susquehanna River was the recognized physical northern boundary of the slaveholding empire. South of it was Maryland and Virginia. North of it was the precarious promise of freedom. Columbia, which is situated on the river's eastern bank in Lancaster County, became the great depot where freedom seekers first landed.
And there was a very specific piece of infrastructure that made Columbia the epicenter, right? The Columbia-Wrightsville Bridge.
Yes, the bridge.
According to Whipper's own writings in that 1871 letter, this long bridge was the only safe outlet by which escaping individuals could successfully evade their pursuers. He wrote that once they crossed that broad, silvery stream to the western shore, they could look back at the slave power and say, "Thus far shalt thou come, and no farther."
The mechanics of the route are fascinating. Before this bridge became the focal point, the route for freedom seekers was usually from Baltimore up through Havre de Grace to Philadelphia.
Right.
But that required a highly dangerous exposed river crossing. So the geographic math shifted. The route moved 58 miles west to York, Pennsylvania, and from York they would make their way to Columbia in the dead of night, specifically aiming for that bridge.
And where exactly is William Whipper's house located?
Right
at the end of that bridge. He deliberately positions his home at the most critical choke point of the entire escape route.
Yeah.
He is literally the gatekeeper.
He kept the station. He wrote that he was frequently called up in the night to take charge of passengers. Imagine the reality of that. You are a wealthy merchant by day, and at 2 a.m., you are opening your door to people who are almost always completely exhausted, starving, and penniless.
Just desperate people.
Yeah, he would take them in, feed them, shelter them. Sometimes it was just one person. Sometimes he would have 17 people hiding in his home in a single night. He personally passed hundreds of people to the land of freedom.
Okay, we need to pause and look at the sheer logistics of this. How on earth does one man run a massive, highly visible lumber and railroad investment firm by day and a massive, highly illegal underground smuggling operation by night without getting caught?
It sounds impossible.
It seems physically impossible to keep those two lives separate.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the answer is that he didn't keep them separate.
Oh, he combined them.
He integrated them completely. He weaponized his capitalist ventures for the cause of abolition. He didn't just run a business and do charity on the side. His business was the Underground Railroad.
I really want to understand the exact mechanics of that.
Yeah.
Like, how do you hide an illegal smuggling ring inside a 19th century lumberyard?
Well, think about the daily operations of a premier lumberyard. It requires a massive amount of manual labor. You're moving timber, loading carts, stacking planks. Whipper simply employed many of these freedom seekers right there in his yards.
Wow.
He gave them excellent work for men of color that actually paid a living wage. They could blend in seamlessly with the local bustling workforce. To an outside observer or even a slave catcher just passing through, it just looked like a busy industrial site. Meanwhile, these men are earning money, getting fed, and preparing for the next leg of their journey.
It's the ultimate hiding in plain sight. You don't need a secret basement if you have a massive, legitimate payroll.
Exactly. And, it didn't start with the lumberyard. Whipper was also investing heavily in the Columbia and Reading Railroad.
Railroads, too.
Yeah. He partnered with another highly successful Black businessman named William Goodrich, who operated the Reliance line over in York. Together, Goodrich and Whipper used their ownership, their capital, and their access to build secret compartments directly into their own railcars.
That is incredible.
They were transporting commercial lumber by day and human lives by night, moving seekers safely from York to Columbia and eventually on to Philadelphia.
So he controls the jobs, he controls the physical transportation infrastructure, and he controls the geography at the bridge. It's a masterclass in logistical leverage.
True.
But this level of prosperity and this level of subversion did not happen in a vacuum.
Right.
A Black man accruing this much wealth and controlling this much infrastructure in the 1830s and 40s inevitably triggered a severe systemic backlash.
Oh, absolutely. The status quo of 19th century America was incredibly hostile. The danger was not just abstract political tension, it was violent, legal, and systemic. We see this escalating sharply after 1831.
Right.
Following a rebellion of enslaved Virginians that year, the political climate nationwide turned fiercely against prosperous people of color. In Pennsylvania, this resulted in a devastating legal blow, the ratification of a new state constitution that entirely stripped Black men of their voting rights.
Just took them away entirely.
Men who had previously voted as lawful citizens, who paid taxes and owned massive businesses, were suddenly and legally disenfranchised.
And that legal disenfranchisement was immediately accompanied by physical violence.
Yeah.
We see white-led riots erupting in both Philadelphia and Columbia.
Yeah.
Black business people were specifically targeted. Stephen Smith, Whipper's partner, was receiving anonymous death threats. And the systemic indignities were just constant. Think about Stephen Smith again. He was literally the largest stakeholder in the Columbia-Wrightsville Bridge Company.
The very bridge that defined the town's geography and economy.
Yes. Yet, purely because of his race, he was legally barred from serving as its president.
You can own the bridge, you can fund the bridge, but you cannot be given the title to run the bridge. It really highlights the profound absurdity and the deep insecurity of the white power structure at the time.
Seriously.
Yet amid all this danger, amid the death threats and the stripping of constitutional rights, Whipper refuses to retreat into quiet compliance. In 1833, he is chosen to write and deliver a eulogy in Philadelphia for William Wilberforce, the British abolitionist. And he uses this highly public platform not just to mourn Wilberforce, but to go on the offensive.
He really does. He dangerously castigates a group called the American Colonization Society. And we need to explain who they were because it sounds like a benign historical society, but it was actually a massive threat.
The American Colonization Society was a powerful, well-funded organization formed with the express purpose of encouraging, or honestly, more accurately, pressuring free African Americans to leave the United States and relocate to Africa, specifically to a colony that would become Liberia.
And they had massive institutional backing. We are talking about prominent white politicians, slaveholders, and religious leaders who fundamentally believed that free Black people and white people could not coexist in America.
Yeah, the highest levels of power.
For a wealthy Black businessman like Whipper, who had built an empire in Pennsylvania, this society was essentially advocating for his deportation.
So Whipper stands up in public in this incredibly volatile environment and labels the American Colonization Society the arch enemy of liberty.
To speak that boldly against an organization with that much institutional and governmental backing, while you are simultaneously losing your voting rights and your business partners getting death threats, I mean, the physical courage required is staggering. He is painting a target on his own back.
It was a very dangerous time to be bold. And unfortunately, that danger was only going to compound because the localized tensions in Pennsylvania were about to be supercharged by federal law.
So what does this all mean for Columbia and for Whipper's network? It all culminates in the crisis of 1850.
The Fugitive Slave Act.
Exactly. If things were tense before, 1850 turned Columbia into a localized apocalypse. Suddenly, the federal government is actively mandating that authorities in free states must cooperate in capturing escaped slaves, and it imposes heavy, ruinous penalties on anyone aiding an escape.
It completely shattered what Whipper called the fatal dream of security.
Wow, fatal dream.
Yeah. Before 1850, the liberty-loving citizens of Columbia kind of derided the slave catchers. The fugitives living there, many of whom had been there for years, felt they could protect themselves. But this new federal law changed the math entirely. Southerners began pouring into Pennsylvania with the full legal authority of the United States government to kidnap not just recent escapees, but free Black people who had built lives there.
The sources describe the immediate shock and terror of it. A prominent man named Baker was arrested, taken to Philadelphia, handed over by the commissioner, and literally had to be purchased back by the citizens of Columbia.
Stop.
Another man, named Smith, was shot dead right inside one of the lumber yards simply because he refused to surrender, and his murderer was permitted to escape without any arrest or trial.
You can imagine the psychological toll that takes on a community. The white citizens of Columbia, feeling the majesty and power of this new federal law, start backing away, talking about how insecure these exiles are. Meanwhile, the Black citizens of Columbia are thrust into an existential crisis. Do they flee? Do they fight?
Whipper's 1871 letter describes this moment so vividly. He notes that the Black community began holding secret meetings, and the discussions in these meetings weren't about quiet compliance or moral reform anymore.
No, the time for that was over.
Right. He compares their resolves to the patriotic outbursts of the American Revolution. He says some were in favor of killing anyone who attacked them, of setting their own houses on fire, and then burning the entire town to the ground.
It's a terrifying, explosive moment. Whipper specifically notes that the spirit animating them was the old spirit of the Russians burning Moscow to thwart Napoleon, or the Black revolutionaries of Haiti.
Scorched earth.
They were ready to scorch the earth rather than be dragged back into bondage. And this is the crucible where Whipper's pragmatism is truly tested. He steps into these secret meetings, surrounded by people who are heavily armed and ready to go to war, and he has to make a choice.
He writes, "At this point, my self-interest mingled with my sense of humanity, and I felt that I occupied a more responsible position than I shall ever attain to again." He decides to exhort them to peace and patience. He begs them to leave town as early as they can for their own sakes and to prevent innocent suffering.
Yeah.
He outright admits that if he had advocated a different course, he could have easily caused the burning of the entire town.
He manages to produce a fragile calm, but as he notes, it only lasted for a few days. Because the theoretical danger suddenly became a very specific physical threat knocking on one man's door.
Because of that extreme threat to his commercial assets and his community, we have to look closely at how he navigated the immediate fallout. To truly understand the intense pressure cooker of 1850 in Columbia, we have to zoom in on one specific, incredibly detailed incident recounted in Whipper's letter.
Ah, the Dorsey crisis.
Yes, the attempted capture of the Methodist preacher, Dorsey.
It is a phenomenal case study in exactly how Whipper operated under extreme duress. It strips away the theory and shows us the raw mechanics of his pragmatism.
So the temporary calm in Columbia is broken when word spreads through the borough that claimants are in town looking for this preacher named Dorsey, and they plan to take him that very night.
Whipper doesn't wait around for the authorities. At 9:00 p.m., he goes directly to Dorsey's house. But the tension is so high that he has refused admittance until the people inside verify exactly who he is.
They were on high alert.
Oh, yeah. When the door finally opens, he finds several men in the house, all heavily armed with deadly weapons, just waiting for the intruders to arrive. Whipper notes that if the slave catchers had come, the entire party would have been massacred.
Imagine the sensory reality of that room. It's 9 p.m., it's dark. You have a group of desperate men holding whatever weapons they could find, barricaded in a small house, waiting for federal agents to kick the door down. So Whipper, the pragmatist, immediately advises Dorsey to leave, to run.
But Dorsey flat out refuses.
Exactly. He tells Whipper he'd been taken up once before alive, but he never would be again. The armed men with him back him up. They say they've lived together and they will die together.
Dorsey's reasoning is heartbreakingly practical, though. He tells Whipper he has no money. He says he would rather die at home with his family than be killed out on the road while trying to run away penniless.
But this is where William Whipper, the wealthy businessman, kicks into high gear. He doesn't offer prayers. He offers a financial bailout. He asks Dorsey, "How much money do you want to start with?" Whipper reaches into his pocket and hands him $100 in physical gold on the spot.
Which is a massive sum of money at that time, but Dorsey looks at it and says, that is not enough.
I love the tension here. The slave catchers could arrive at literally any second, and they are haggling.
I know, it's like a movie.
So Whipper counters, will $200 do? Dorsey agrees. Whipper promises to bring the rest the next morning. When he returns with the rest of the gold, Dorsey throws up another roadblock. He says he can't leave unless his family is taken care of. So Whipper promises to furnish his family with provisions for the next 6 months.
And Dorsey still has one more concern. He says he has 2 small houses worth $475. He can't just abandon his hard-earned equity. So Whipper says, I will sell them for you and give the money to your family. He takes a power of attorney right there, attends to all the affairs, and Dorsey finally leaves the next day, escaping safely to Boston.
It's an incredible scene. It reads like a high-stakes corporate negotiation, but the commodity on the table is a man's life. But there is a detail here that we really need to unpack. Why was Dorsey so incredibly stubborn? Why was a Methodist preacher so ready to enact a bloodbath in his living room?
To understand that, we have to look at the flashback Whipper provides in his letter. He explains a pivotal event from almost 20 years prior, around 1831 or 1832.
He tells the story of Joseph Purvis.
Joseph Purvis was the younger brother of Robert Purvis, another incredibly prominent abolitionist. Joseph was about 19 or 20 years old at the time, visiting Stephen Smith in Columbia.
Okay.
While he was there, slave catchers actually managed to secure Dorsey and were already 2 miles down the road toward Lancaster with him.
Whipper describes young Purvis with such reverence. He calls him one of nature's noblemen, fierce, fiery, impulsive. When Purvis hears that Dorsey has been taken, his natural and instinctive love of freedom fired up his warm Southern blood.
Purvis doesn't hesitate. He goes to where some black men are working, gives a Herculean shout, and says, to arms, boys, we must rescue this man. I shall lead if you will follow.
Wow.
They respond, we will, and they literally chase down the catchers, violently disperse them, and bring Dorsey back to Columbia in triumph.
But the crucial part is what Purvis does after the rescue. He hands Dorsey his personal pistol, and he gives Dorsey an injunction. Use this pistol and die in defense of your liberty rather than ever be taken into bondage again.
And Dorsey promised he would.
And that promise haunted him. Whipper writes that when he walked into Dorsey's house that night in 1850, almost 2 decades later, that exact same pistol was sitting right there on the table.
It's chilling.
Whipper realized that the lesson Purvis had taught Dorsey hadn't just been remembered, it had become incorporated into his very nature. It had become a part of his religion.
Which makes Whipper's ability to talk him down even more impressive. He isn't just fighting the immediate physical threat of the slave catchers. He is fighting a 20-year-old blood oath made to a local hero.
Yeah, that's heavy.
And this is where Whipper's 1871 letter gets incredibly, almost shockingly honest. Because after praising Purvis as a hero and a man of noble daring, Whipper pivots and explains his own internal motivation for defusing the Dorsey situation.
Right. This part is wild.
He writes, at this point, a conscientious regard for truth dictates that I should state that my disposition to make a sacrifice for the removal of Dorsey was aided by my own desire for self-preservation.
I read that line and literally had to do a double take. He admits that he bailed out Dorsey, handing over hundreds of dollars in gold, partly to save his own skin. He explains that word had spread down south that Smith and Whipper, the Negro lumber merchants, were secreting fugitive slaves. Because of this, arsonists had already tried to set fire to their lumberyard twice to punish them.
Whipper did the math in that room. He realized that if a shootout happened at Dorsey's house, not only would there be a prodigal waste of human life, but the backlash from the white authorities and the mob would be catastrophic.
They'd burn it all down.
They wouldn't just arrest the survivors. They would come for the most valuable property in the village, his lumberyard. He says he would have freely paid $1,000 just to be insured against the consequences of such a riot.
I want to push back on this a little bit, or at least examine the discomfort it causes. Isn't it almost taboo in our historical narratives to admit something like that?
It definitely is.
We want our heroes to be entirely selfless, like acting purely on moral outrage, admitting that you negotiated a man's escape partly to protect your own commercial real estate. It feels like it taints the heroism, doesn't it?
This raises an important question, and it gets to the absolute core of Whipper's specific genius. We have to completely separate the idea of effective activism from the idea of martyrdom.
Okay, go on.
Whipper wasn't a martyr, he was a pragmatist. Think about the stakes. If his lumberyard burns down, what happens? Yes, he loses his personal wealth, but far more importantly, the Underground Railroad loses its primary engine of funding, its safest employment hub, and its logistical cover in that entire region.
That is the crux of it. The business wasn't separate from the cause. The business funded the cause. If he lets the town burn, he loses the ability to save the next 100 people.
And he proved that immediately. After defusing the riot, saving Dorsey's life, and protecting his property, he didn't just hoard his wealth and hide.
Right.
The text explicitly states that he then went out and borrowed $1,400 on his own individual account to assist many others to flee to a land where the soil wasn't polluted by slavery. He saved the golden goose so it could keep laying golden eggs for the abolitionist movement.
It is a stunning level of self-awareness. He knows he isn't the fiery guy charging down the road with a pistol like Purvis. He is the guy with the ledger, calculating how to save the most lives while keeping the infrastructure intact.
Exactly.
But despite his best efforts, the pressure in Pennsylvania was becoming insurmountable. Because of that extreme threat to his commercial assets and his community, Whipper realizes the geographic math of Pennsylvania is broken. The border of safety has moved. If his network is going to survive, he has to look north.
The numbers from Columbia are stark. Because of the terror brought by the 1850 Act, the Black population of Columbia plummeted. In just 5 years, it went from 943 down to 487.
Wow, cut in half.
Nearly half the community emigrated. They had to seek a new, ultimate destination.
And that destination was Canada. Whipper realized he couldn't just pass people across the Columbia-Wrightsville Bridge anymore. That was no longer far enough. He had to get them across an international border. So in 1853, he actually travels to Ontario himself to ascertain the condition of the people he had already helped send there.
Doing his due diligence.
Yeah. He finds them contented and prosperous, which induces him to purchase land on the Sydenham River in a town called Dresden.
Dresden was a crucial hub for freedom seekers. It had agricultural land, it had a viable lumber trade, and it was under the passionate leadership of Josiah Henson.
And Josiah Henson is a massive historical figure in his own right. The sources note his memoirs actually inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe to write Uncle Tom's Cabin.
That's right.
So Whipper establishes a foothold in Dresden. He sets up business ventures, and a few of his immediate family members, including his sister Mary Ann and her husband James Hollinsworth, they move there permanently to oversee his investments. He visits annually and begins forcefully recommending Canada as the only safe haven.
But this shift in strategy was incredibly controversial, even among his allies. He writes that he always persuaded seekers to go to Canada because he had absolutely zero faith in their ability to elude slave hunters in the U.S.
Which is fair.
But the local white merchants in Columbia, who had previously enjoyed the economic benefits of this cheap, hardworking labor pool, wanted the refugees to stay.
They did. Whipper notes that his friends told him he was injuring the trade of the place by persuading the laborers to leave. They prioritized their local economy over the physical safety of the workers.
Which is pretty grim.
Yeah, it is. But it wasn't just the white merchants who were upset. This is another moment where Whipper's honesty is just striking. He admits that many of the fugitives themselves looked upon him with jealousy and expressed fierce indignation.
The human element of that is agonizing. Whippy notes that they accused him of trying to have them removed from peace and plenty to a land that was cold and barren, to starve to death.
That's rough.
Imagine the burden of that. You are spending your own money, risking your own life to move people to safety, and the people you are saving are angry with you because the safety is in a freezing, unfamiliar wilderness.
Imagine being in Whipper's shoes. You have to look someone in the eye and say, I know you have a job here, I know you have a community here, but the federal government is coming for you, and you will die or be enslaved if you stay.
He had to be the bad guy.
Right. He saw the long game. He knew the peace and plenty of Columbia was a fragile illusion that could be shattered by a slave catcher at any moment. He was willing to endure their anger to ensure their permanent freedom.
And he scales up this Canadian operation significantly. In the late 1850s and early 1860s, he doesn't just use railcars anymore. He buys a ship.
A whole ship.
He partners with George de Baptist to purchase a steamboat called the T. Whitney.
Which requires an entirely new level of logistical planning. Like, how do you hide people on a commercial steamboat on the Great Lakes?
Just like the lumberyard and the railcars, the steamboat serves a dual purpose. It is a fully functional commercial vessel shipping lumber between Sandusky, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, and Amherstburg, Ontario.
Right.
It has cargo manifests, captains, and legitimate routes. But within that commercial operation, it is a massive floating station on the Underground Railroad. They would hide escaping slaves among the lumber or in restricted compartments, smuggling them across Lake Erie to Canada under the guise of international trade.
He literally built an international multimodal transportation network for freedom: rail, river, and lake. It's staggering. But as we move into the 1860s, the entire landscape of the country fractures, right? The Civil War breaks out.
Whipper had actually been preparing to leave for Canada permanently in the spring of 1861. The danger had just become too great. But when the war begins, he changes his mind. He writes that with the progress of the war, he began to realize the prospect of a new civilization. He concluded he needed to remain and share the fortunes of his hitherto ill-fated country.
And he puts his money where his mouth is, yet again.
No.
He writes to Still, quantifying his financial impact. He says, directly and indirectly, from 1847 to 1860, he contributed $1,000 annually from his earnings.
A huge sum.
And during the 5 years of the war, he contributed a like amount, another $1,000 a year, specifically to put down the rebellion.
That is an astonishing amount of capital for a private citizen to inject into a social cause during the 19th century. He is privately funding the logistics of freedom and then pivoting to privately fund the war effort against the Confederacy.
And his influence wasn't just financial, it remained deeply political. After the war, he returns to Philadelphia. Though he keeps properties in Columbia, he keeps writing articles, keeps giving speeches. And this culminates in a massive historic moment in 1866.
The meeting with the President of the United States.
Whipper joins Frederick Douglass, arguably the most famous black man in America, in a historic face-to-face meeting with President Andrew Johnson.
Just incredible.
Think about the trajectory of his life to get to that room. From a steam scourer in Philadelphia to standing in the White House, their goal, to advocate directly for black suffrage.
Now, President Johnson, being who he was, rejected their proposal in the room. It was a tense, ultimately frustrating meeting. But the pressure they applied, the massive political movement they represented, could not be stopped by one man.
No.
4 years later, Congress passes the 15th Amendment, legally giving black men the right to vote.
Though, as our sources tragically note, in actual practice, state laws, local laws, and horrific threats of violence often kept black men from actually exercising that right for decades to come.
The fight was never just one battle. But Whipper's legacy in that fight is undeniable. And it's a legacy that lived on far beyond his death in 1876.
If he's pouring thousands of dollars into the Civil War and standing face to face with a president, I have to imagine he's passing this aggressive pragmatism down to his family. This isn't a legacy that just dies with him.
Absolutely not. Remember, he built a dynasty. He raised his nephew, James Whipper Purnell, as his own son, teaching him both the lumber business and the inner workings of the Underground Railroad.
Oh.
Purnell became a prominent lumber merchant in Ontario and even served as secretary to Martin R. Delaney. According to W.E.B. Du Bois, Purnell was also a member of the famous John Brown Convention held in Chatham.
So the activism was deeply inherited. The infrastructure of resistance was passed down right alongside the commercial real estate.
And it continued through the generations. James Purnell's son, Dr. William Whipper Purnell, graduated from Howard University School of Medicine and served in the U.S. Army. Then his son, Lee Julian Purnell, became one of the very first African Americans to graduate from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, earning a degree in electrical engineering and later becoming the dean of engineering at Howard University for 20 years.
From an enslaved mother in Lancaster County to a secret empire on the Susquehanna River to the engineering department at MIT. That is the trajectory William Whipper set in motion.
He laid a foundation of excellence, capital, and access that his descendants built upon for a century.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When you step back and look at the totality of William Whipper's life, you realize he defies every simple categorization.
He really does.
He wasn't just a philosopher writing essays on nonviolence. He wasn't just a ruthless businessman expanding his market share. He was someone who figured out the exact alchemy of turning cold, hard capital into literal breathing freedom.
He looked at the system of American capitalism, a system deeply intertwined with and dependent upon slavery, and he essentially hacked it.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
He used its own tools, railroads, steamboats, property deeds, and gold, to dismantle its most horrific institution from the inside out.
It really makes you look at your own resources differently. I mean, what is your leverage? For those of you listening, Whipper used every single tool at his disposal. He used his grocery store to boycott slave labor. He used his lumberyard to provide wages. He used his railcars to hide fugitives. He used his pen to change minds.
Yeah.
He didn't wait for the perfect, risk-free moment to act, because that moment doesn't exist.
Yeah.
He acted pragmatically, protecting his assets so he could continue funding the resistance.
And yet, despite all his wealth, he understood exactly what was truly valuable. I think the most powerful distillation of who he was comes at the very end of his letter to William Still.
Right.
Looking back on his life, having spent thousands upon thousands of dollars, having risked his empire and his life repeatedly, he writes, "I would prefer today to be penniless in the streets, rather than to have withheld a single hour's labor or a dollar from the sacred cause of liberty, justice, and humanity."
Penniless in the streets. He's from a man who built an absolute empire.
It forces a profound reevaluation. We often think of immense wealth and deep morality as being inherently at odds, especially in historical context. But Whipper forces us to ask a much harder question.
What's that?
If you manage to acquire immense wealth and power within a fundamentally unjust society, is the only truly moral way to use it to secretly, methodically dismantle the very system that allowed you to get rich in the first place.
So what does this all mean? It means history isn't just made by the martyrs, it's made by the pragmatists holding the ledger. That is exactly the kind of question that stays with you long after the history books are closed. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the extraordinary life of William Whipper. Keep asking those hard questions.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Uncharted Lancaster podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating or review wherever you listen. It really helps more people discover the show. For more fascinating local history, visit unchartedlancaster.com. And if you'd like to go deeper, check out one of Adam Zern's books at unchartedlancaster.com/books. Until next time, keep exploring.